Welcome to Brookings. I want to thank Amy Liu, Metro's director, Alan B. Ruby, the Census Guru, and General John Allen for gathering us here today, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I am Cheryl Cohen-Efron, a trustee here at Brookings and treasurer of the board. For most of the last 5 years, I sat on the City Planning Commission in New York, where I had the honor to be a colleague of the amazing Joe Salvo, New York's demographer-in-chief, who was supposed to be here with us today, but air traffic has unfortunately kept him from us. But I did want to recognize my dear friend Sean Donovan, who was the Secretary of HUD and the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and knows from that experience, as well as being head of Housing Preservation and Development in New York City before that, just how important the census is. There is no greater act of democracy than making sure every person is counted. The 10-year census remains the bedrock for American political representation and distribution of public resources. It informs our understanding of who we are and how we are doing, especially for the extraordinary scholars here at Brookings. Notwithstanding a complicated national history that has too often subjugated or excluded people of color, women, or migrants, the census has always endeavored to count everyone in the United States. It is a federally mandated chance to create real equity to make sure everyone counts by making sure we count everyone. As I like to say, perhaps a little bit too often, it just makes census. And while the first census occurred in 1790, just after Washington was inaugurated as president, I only wish Lin-Manuel Miranda had chosen to write some clever song about the census in his musical Hamilton. I suspect you all agree it would have made the marketing of the subject just a little bit easier if every middle schooler and her parents were wandering the streets of every city rapping about the census. Nonetheless, there are both great opportunities and some challenges which require some creative solutions between now and April 1st, 2020, Census Day, which is, yes, on April Fool's Day. This census is an existential matter for cities. I believe no one understands the risk and opportunities of cities in this matter better than the Metro program at Brookings and the League of Cities, and those of you in the room here today. In a time when the future of federal funding for the social safety net, such as there is, could increasingly come in the form of block grants, it is necessary for every person to be counted, but also for the states and cities themselves to have a real count of its citizens to whom they will have to deliver services to broaden economic development, provide affordable housing, make transportation decisions, and even create real equity in social justice. Without it, we cannot plan properly, and without planning, those with the least equity tend to suffer the most. With echoes of claims of recent voter suppression, there are fears of census suppression of residents without citizenship. Much of this is now in the hands of the Supreme Court, and I'm sure we'll hear more on this today. But equally unknown are the questions around some of the changes in the 2020 census we know are already happening. With the move to tech-based census taking, will the elderly and under-resourced be more difficult to count? The conditions of both the economy and the Census Bureau are different than they were 10 years ago when we were in the midst of the Great Recession with many looking for work. This time, we are at nearly full employment. With the push for citizens rather than green card holders as enumerators, there is concern about where we will find qualified workers. In New York, the business and civic community is coordinating their census efforts in unprecedented ways. Branch libraries, YMCAs, and smaller community-based organizations are poised to work with government leadership and philanthropy. Despite all of the cross-sector cooperation, it becomes clearer each day a successful census requires more help from the federal government. As a possible bright spot, I wonder how the privately funded election tech developed to increase voter turnout in the 2018 midterms could be repurposed for greater census participation. In the end, a little friendly competition for cities around counting each of their residents is not a bad thing. New Yorkers do take note when they see Mayor Garcetti and the governor in California allocating resources early to the effort. It is my personal hope that many of you will identify best practices around the census, particularly in hard-to-count neighborhoods, and make them as open source as possible. We are all pushing towards April Fool's Day 2020, and let's make sure cities and their leadership don't foolishly squander this precious time. For these reasons and others, I'm excited to convene today's conversation, which aims to bridge national and local conversations on the state of the 2020 census, 1 year ahead of the Census Day. We are all delighted that Brookings Metro has partnered with the National League of Cities Institute for this event. Its Executive Director, Clarence Anthony, will moderate the second panel, featuring experts on how local communities are responding to the challenges of ensuring a fair and accurate count of their populations in 2020. But first, our opening panel will focus on the national outlook for the census from here in D.C. I am so pleased to introduce our moderator for this panel, Tara Barhampour, from the Washington Post, where she writes about aging, generations, and demography. Thank you, Tara.
Okay, can everyone hear me now? Great. Thanks so much, Cheryl, and thank you for having us, for Brookings for doing this panel. It's very timely, and so glad to be here with three people that I rely on very often to talk with me and help educate me and give perspectives about the census. Bill Fry, who's a senior fellow here and demographer, and Vanita Gupta, president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, John Thompson, executive director, Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics, and a former director at the Census. So this census, as a reporter, is really one of the most sort of newsy censuses I've ever seen, for many reasons. Even before the citizenship question, there was a lot going on, but in the past year, it's really ramped up and been front page news in a way that I hadn't seen before in other decennial censuses. It's become much more politicized. There's questions about funding, and then, of course, it's the first time that it's going to be done online, largely online, and that, we haven't seen how that's going to work yet. So there's a lot going on. So without taking up too much more time, I want to get into the meat of our discussion and start with the news that came out this morning. There was a tweet by the president saying that the census would be meaningless without the citizenship question. This comes, on Census Day. There was an event that the Census Bureau held with Director Dillingham, where this didn't come up at the event, but it did raise the question of, how is the Census Bureau going to be able to defend against this sort of message if this is what's coming from the White House? And John, I'd like to start with you as a former director, kind of, being in that position and thinking about, how they might respond to this sort of message coming out.
Well, I know how I would respond, and that is that I disagree with the tweet. I've testified in 2 court cases that there's no basis for the citizenship question to be on the 2020 Census questionnaire, and in fact, the research that's been conducted by the Census Bureau itself indicates that it will have an effect that will lower self-response and decrease the accuracy of the census. So I think it was a very unfortunate tweet. Of course, the director of the Census Bureau, when Dr. Dillingham accepted the job, Dr. Dillingham understood that the decision had already been made from the administration to put the citizenship question on there. So I have some sympathy for him in terms of not voicing an opinion on it.
Vanita?
Okay. So I'm assuming many people know the kind of backstory to the addition of the question, but I think it's worth mentioning that there have been 2 recent trials, and actually a third where we're awaiting a decision, that have challenged the addition of this question, and that when Secretary Ross added this question in March of 2018, he did so under a pretext that the Justice Department had actually asked for this question in order to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And my prior position was that I headed up the Civil Rights Division for President Obama's Justice Department. And we oversaw the voting rights enforcement, and never in the history of the voting rights enforcement framework enacted in 1965 has there ever been a citizenship question on the short form of the census. And so it was pretty clear quite immediately that this was a ruse, although the litigation really, in quite stark terms and emails and communications that were going back and forth, revealed that Steve Bannon and Chris Kobach had been lobbying the Commerce Secretary for this question, and that the ask of the Justice Department to ask for this question was really a back-end rationale. And certainly this morning's tweet is deeply unhelpful for those of us who around the country are working to ensure that the hardest to count communities have faith that they make themselves counted in this endeavor. When this question was first added, a lot of us as advocates were met with the question, well, should we boycott the census? How do we protect our communities? You all can imagine the level of fear in immigrant communities and communities of color around reporting data. We've seen what happened to Dreamers who were told to trust the government, and then the administration changed and policy priorities changed. And so this kind of tweet actually does a real disservice to the ability to get to a fair and accurate count. As John said, the Census Bureau's own research has been very clear about the concerns around massive under-response should this question remain. For those of us working around the country, we're kind of working to make sure whatever the scenario is, whatever the Supreme Court decision is, whatever Congress, we're saying we can't just leave it to the courts. Congress should act as well. But there really is a concern that if communities choose to opt themselves out affirmatively, or if people really try to, first of all, it's against the law to do that. Second of all, in my mind, there's nothing more that Steve Bannon would want than a systematic undercount of communities of color, and to radically rechange how redistricting happens. The ultimate goal is to change the denominator of how districts get carved out. And so this is an unfortunate incident. It won't probably be the last, but we are in the middle of a massive organizing effort, get out the count, given all of that's at stake, and there are a lot of people involved, and we have to counter these kinds of messages that really put the census, what should be a nonpartisan activity, at risk.
Bill, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to add, I'm a scholar. I'm not working in the outreach community. I'm not working with the Census Bureau, but I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I've been following the Census Bureau's work for a long time. And I think this tweet today and the press conference today showed something that's really kind of important, and that is the people that answered the question or didn't answer that question when it was posed to them about the tweet were very much interested in the business of getting the census done. And I think at this point, a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss today and are discussing in the news has been foisted upon the Census Bureau politically and in various other ways, in terms of the funding they may have gotten earlier this decade, in terms of this citizenship question, which I think, as we've heard, the in-house folks think is not going to help have an accurate census, and in terms of other ways, such as perhaps cybersecurity issues, which are sort of beyond them.
Yeah, you just have to hold it.
Hold it, okay. Well, I'm not going to start again, but in a nutshell, I think the census people are under a lot of pressure of other kinds of issues that are politically put upon them, and I think they're doing as good as they can to kind of get this census done as best as they can. But because of the kinds of pressures that they're developed, it's so important that there's outreach from communities of all kinds of groups at the partnership level, at complete count committees, all of these things. It's more important now than ever that people try to make a good census out of this. The professionals at the Census Bureau are doing their best, but I think they're under a lot of pressure and a lot of sort of bad things happening to them, and I think they'll be able to get around it if everybody contributes.
Thank you. We will circle back again to the citizenship question, but putting it aside for a minute, there are overall concerns about whether the Bureau is adequately resourced to carry out a full, fair, and accurate count based on several matters. There's some question about whether there's enough funding being proposed for the census for this coming year. And also, testing was not performed up to the level that had been planned because of earlier funding concerns. And then the census is going to be performed largely online for the first time, and there are also concerns about cybersecurity, hacking, phishing, disinformation campaigns. How worried are you about these factors? And I want to start with you again, Bill, and then we'll...
Sure. I mean, under a normal census, we've seen for the last several censuses, there are certain groups that tend to be undercounted. Hispanics, African Americans, renters, but especially people who are under the age of 5. About 5% of the people under the age of 5 were uncounted in the 2010 census. And if we look at the numbers going forward, and of those people who were the under age of 5, the most likely to be undercounted were African Americans and Hispanics. Something like 7% of kids under age 5 who were Hispanic were not counted in the 2010 census. Now as we move to this new census, the child population demographically is going to be minority white, the people who are under age 5. Latinos are going to be 26% of that group. African Americans, 14% of that group. Asians, 6% of that group. It's really important of all these groups that young child population gets counted better. And some of the issues, one of them is the demographic change, which even though there's been undercount of those groups in the past, and now that the demography is changing, it'll potentially even be a bigger undercount of that group. Then there's the internet issue. And it may be that some of those households are not as directly linked into the internet as other parts of the population. People who have language are isolated linguistically, people who are in poverty areas and so forth aren't going to have that kind of access. And of course, this political climate, which we're talking about, maybe more tweets. So I think that, you know, given the changing demography of the United States, we're becoming much more racially diverse than we were before. It's even more important that all of these different groups go out and try to get their folks to be involved in the census in any way they possibly can, because I think it really is a challenge for a lot of different reasons.
Can you speak to the Can you speak, John, to the funding and the testing question?
I can speak to that. A little history, and that is the census planning effort from 2012 through 2017 was underfunded by the Congress to the tune of over $200 million, which caused the Census Bureau to prioritize. And the Bureau prioritized on automation. And in full disclosure, I was part of that prioritization, but we didn't think we could do a paper and pencil census anymore. It was just infeasible, so we prioritized on the automation. What that meant was that some small operations didn't get automated. We had to scale back some of the testing, like Tara mentioned, specifically for the end-to-end test, which was going to be 3 sites and was reduced to 1. On the other hand, it seems that in 2018 and 2019, the Bureau has received the funding it's asked for. In fact, in 2018, they received $1 billion more than they asked for, and in 2019, they received what they asked for. So looking at it today, I think the best measures would be how is the Bureau progressing in terms of its spending and buildup. Right now, they announced this morning that they're on schedule to lease their offices, that hiring is going well for building up for their address canvassing operation, and that they're on schedule to hire the partnership specialists that they need to hire. Now, that's what the Bureau says. It seems to me that they do appear to be on schedule at this point. But again, like Bill said, the big thing is that even though the Census Bureau is going to try as hard as they can to count everyone, the climate under which they're conducting the census is going to make that very, very difficult, which is why it's going to be really important to marshal the local resources and partners to get the word out about the importance of the census, and that the Census Bureau doesn't give data to anyone. The responses to the census are kept confidential, but that message is going to be, I believe, very hard to get out.
And Vanita, do you feel that there's adequate resourcing and with the proposed funding is enough?
Well, there's a discrepancy between what Secretary Ross asked for just a few months ago and what was in the president's budget. And so I know the Bureau today has been saying that they have adequate funding, but that discrepancy is confusing to those of us who've been advocating very strenuously for an increased budget. So it doesn't feel to us on the outside that the funding level is yet adequate, and we are continuing to push, given that we typically in this final year before the actual count, the budget should be twice that it was last year because of the amount of investment that's required in the infrastructure. Given the political climate, it seems like that much more important for the Bureau to have a really strong, more robust than ever before communications program, partnership programs. And look, the Bureau is not going to be able to do this by themselves. It's why you have the state of California kicking in $90 million for California. We need states, more and more states, to be kicking in this money out of a recognition of just how vulnerable communities and people are feeling right now. But also, philanthropy has really kind of organized itself in a much more serious way to be able to assist local organizers and local organizations to get involved. It's not going to work to have men in suits knocking on doors saying, "I'm from the government. Please give me your information." And so the importance actually of having mayors and local electeds working with local community leaders, church leaders, business leaders, and the like, and to have that work funded is as important as ever. So I think the funding issues remain still for those of us in the advocacy community. We're still very concerned. But even the preparedness, and I want to say something about the end-to-end tests. So there were not as many end-to-end tests, which I know is a technical term, but the other thing that has been concerning is that there hasn't been a full end-to-end test that included the citizenship question ever, and that partly because of how atypical the process was. Usually the Census Bureau spends a few years testing a question literally down to its placement on the page about what the impact will be on response rates. And this was a decision that was made in a very different process laid out in litigation, which 2 federal judges have found to have violated the Administrative Procedure Act. But so there is just even a concern around that kind of thing. There are tables that have been formed with tech companies to really do scenario planning on some of the security issues, the concerns around disinformation. We all have to be worried. Every democratic institution that we have, from voting in our elections to census, these are core democratic pillars, are vulnerable to being manipulated, both by folks within our country and clearly by folks outside. And so this need to really be rigorously engaged in this effort to protect our democracy technologically is something that both the Bureau has been looking at, as well as other tech companies working on the outside. So there is work being done to address these factors that are putting the census at risk, but these are precisely the things that need to have adequate funding.
Okay, and just getting back to the citizenship question a little bit, the Supreme Court is planning to rule on this question later this spring, whether it's going to appear on the form or not. Whether or not it appears on the form, can you talk a little bit about what some of the consequences of this discussion have been, and whether it appears? I mean, I think we've talked a lot about sort of why it would be a bad thing for accuracy if it does appear, but even if it doesn't appear on the form, what sort of consequences might come out of that? And we'll start with Vanita.
Well, in some ways, some of the damage has been done already, whether or not the question ultimately makes it on, because the sheer fact that the administration sought to have this added has led people to question, the administration's motivations in collecting the data. And that's a real problem. That's not good. As I said, the census is a nonpartisan activity, and there are laws in place that protect census confidentiality. The census is not to be used for law enforcement purposes. But in this climate of fear, folks, and you can't say that it's illegitimate, but people are questioning whether those legal protections are going to protect them. And so from where we stand, and organizers around the country are, equipped with the messages to make sure that people still have faith and confidence in the census and understand the legal protections, understand that any effort to nefariously interfere with these protections, it will be met by a strenuous legal response. But that is where the harm, in some ways, we now have to kind of fight against this, whether or not the question ultimately ends up on the form. And that literally is knocking on doors and having conversations and having messages out there and having the right messengers reaching people who are most in fear and who often there's a good overlap with those communities and the communities that are also already traditionally the hardest to count.
And Bill, have you done any analyses or do you have any thoughts on the effect of the citizenship question on response rates and on the sort of quality of the data?
Well, I think that the idea, some of the earlier census surveys and research has shown that the households that are going to be most likely not to respond to the census are households that have at least one non-citizen in them. And that's 14% of all the households in the United States. It's 46% of all the Latino households in the United States and 45% of all the Asian households in the United States. They tend to be more likely to have, households are more likely to be like this if they have children under age 10, if they are in urban areas, and of course if they're in big immigrant-rich states. 30% of the households in the state of California have at least one non-citizen in them. And so one of the impacts of this, of course, the Census Bureau is used not only to reallocate seats in Congress, but also to do redistricting within states. So if you have an under-enumeration of young people, of minority people, of urban people in a state like Texas or in a state like California, what's going to happen is you're going to have an overrepresentation of rural people, older people, and white people in those states, much more so than would normally be the case if you had an accurate census. The Census Bureau is also going to put out what's called the PL 171 file, the Public Law 171 file, which is used for redistricting in states. And if the citizenship question goes in it, a state legislature might be tempted to only use the citizen population rather than the total population for its redistricting within states. That's a legal issue. It's going to go to the courts, but this gives them a possibility of doing that, and that, of course, will underrepresent all of those groups almost uniformly in all the states that want to do that. So I think there's a real risk for our democracy as well as for undercounting and the rights of different groups in the United States if this works.
John, did you want to add anything?
I might add just a little bit, and that is if states wanted to use citizenship data, they already could for most parts to do districting because it's available on the American Community Survey. It's available down to block groups, which are about 300 housing units. So the data's there, and that's, again, why it's really mystifying as to why you would put the question on the decennial census.
And just for context, I think to what Bill was saying, in 2016, the Supreme Court, in a case called Evanwell versus U.S., I think it was, articulated a decision that said that apportionment can be based on the total population. And I think it's important. This isn't a move. The addition of the citizenship question wasn't just a move that was an anti-immigrant move per se, but it is about fundamentally changing the denominator of who can be counted and trying to restrict it for some on the basis of citizenship alone and to tee up another case to go before the Supreme Court, a challenge to the Evanwell decision. And so this is part of the backdrop of what's going on. And to me, it's of a piece with some of the broader moves to kind of render invisible certain communities in democratic participation.
Okay, and then once the census count is over, what news do you expect to see coming out of the 2020 census? What do you think it will reveal about how the country is changing and what the narratives of our country are going to be going ahead in the next decade? And Bill, if you could speak with it.
Sure. Well, since we're talking about cities, I think this will wind up being the decade of the city. If we've looked at some of the results of city growth earlier in this decade, we saw many cities were growing much more rapidly than they were last decade. Some of that has slowed a little bit recently. But in the numbers I've looked at, I think that we're going to see that of the 77 cities of 250,000 or more population, 48 of them have already grown as many people now since 2010 than they grew the entire decade prior to that. So some of this city growth that has to do with millennials staying in the cities and the attraction of cities, I think, is going to show up in the census results. We're going to have an aging of the population. For the very first time, there's going to be an actual decline in the population under age 18 in the United States. We already are seeing that in 29 states. But we're also going to see a growth in the 65 and over population by some 40%, which we'll see all over the place, in suburbs and cities and small neighborhoods and so forth. People aren't moving, they're just staying there getting old, and that's what's going to happen in the sense. And in terms of race and ethnicity, we'll probably see the Asian population grow at a faster rate than the Latino population this time around, and a very, very slow growth rate for the white population. Under age 25, whites will be a declining population in the United States, and some 24 states will show a decline in their white population. So all of the growth in those states, except for the couple of them that might lose population, all of that growth is going to be coming from racial minorities, with Latinos playing a big role in it. So those are some of the things I'm looking for in the 2020 census.
Great. I want to make sure we have enough time to get some questions in, so I'm going to open the floor to questions now. We've got mics going around.
Bruce Guthrie, given the amorphousness of the current administration's idea of legal requirements, is there anything really that will stop them from releasing this data to law enforcement? I mean, really?
John, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, there is. The Bureau operates under Title 13 U.S. Code, which prohibits them from giving the data in recognizable form to anyone. They have even the tabulations they put out. They have to put procedures in place to make sure you can't identify individuals or characteristics. So it would take changing that law, which would be a very public event, to allow the data to be given to anyone.
Thank you. Back there.
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for your comment saying that we need people that look like the community, walking in the community, not just people in suits. I really appreciate that. I'm actually the chair for the Complete Count Committee in Alexandria. One of my big concerns is related to the technology and how, from my understanding, they're going to be mailing stuff out with codes, different codes to everybody's house, and then they have to use that code to be able to fill it out. And I just see this as another barrier to trying to fill out the census. So I don't know if you guys could speak to that a little bit and how that might work.
The code, I believe, is optional. You can fill it out without the code. Does that answer? Question here?
Thank you. Sandy Apgar, CSIS. Because so much of our economy, our urban economy, is based on real estate values in one form or other, what's the connection between the census, counting and analysis, and the way in which we ascribe values to property?
Bill, would you like to take that one?
Well, it's a long connected route. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that the census is the gold standard for all of our statistics in the United States for a 10-year period. All of the sample surveys, whether it's government surveys like the American Community Survey, or the kinds of things that private sectors do to be able to evaluate homes and the value of homes and all of that sort of thing, is fundamentally based on the census. So it's nice to have all of these numbers come out toward the end of a census period, but those are the worst numbers of the whole decade. So I think, all of the stuff that you're using is going to depend on a very good census.
Okay, we have a question here and then over there.
Thank you. I'm Genie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'd like to come back to the question of confidentiality and cyber hacking. The census could be the foundation and the backbone of our national interest and national security. What if we are not able to secure the system and we're putting the whole nations online? Have you thought of a way to protect that?
But
John, why don't you start and then we can tell.
Okay, so the Census Bureau works very hard at cybersecurity. They've been working at it all decade. And so before any system is released, it has to undergo extensive testing, including external penetration testing by other people. That being said, and the Census Bureau also, by the way, works with the Department of Homeland Security, the National Institutes of Science and Technology, experts in the private sector as well, to try to maintain state-of-the-art cybersecurity. I mean, that being said, though, there's always a risk, and the Census Bureau is going to have to continue to work very, very hard to keep abreast of what's happening in the world of cyber hacking.
And, there is, so just to build on that, there's both private and Bureau efforts on this issue and scenario planning and the like. I also want to be clear that there will also be door knocking and pen and paper folks. People are sometimes confused that they think the whole thing will only be digital and the only way to fill it out will be digitally, but actually there will be folks that will be knocking on doors should people fail to complete the census. I know you're asking a different question about cybersecurity, which I think, right now there is an acute sense that everything needs to be done to prepare against that and to make sure the infrastructure is secure.
Although the people knocking on doors will have iPhone 8s.
Yes, this is true. You're right. It addresses a little bit the digital divide issue, but not, that's a big issue too, is that not everyone has access to technology. And the irony here is that the folks that may not have access to it, who may also be the most living in fear of the government, and then there will be door knockers. It's again why it returns back to the importance of having people in communities be engaged in this as enumerators in their own community.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Carl Polzer. I'm with inequalityinc.org. So the point's been made that the American Community Survey, you can figure out the citizenship issue. It has a question or some way to figure that out, and the census doesn't. Is there any, it kind of puzzles me. So do we have evidence that there's a difference in the response rate between the census and the American Community Survey for minorities? I mean, is there a way of comparing? And if it's, second question, if that question is invalid or inappropriate for the census, shouldn't it come off the American Community Survey as well?
So one clear difference is the American Community Survey does not go to every household in the country, unlike the decennial census. And so it is used, estimates are gleaned of this information from the American Community Survey, and that is a distinct difference it will impact the overall accuracy of the short form that in 2020, once every 10 years, the census form the short form is sent to every household in the country. The American Community Survey is not, and maybe I'll defer to my colleagues to get into more granular detail about the difference.
Well, I think one of the big concerns a lot of individuals, including myself, have is that the question has never been on the census since 1950. So it's been on a long form, it's been on the American Community Survey. There's been no testing of the effect of that question being asked on a census short form. In addition, there's been no testing of that question being asked without asking the place of birth question right before it. So it's a totally unknown as to what will happen. The Census Bureau did their best to do some research, and it's excellent research, and they did show that based on the research, they do expect there will be a decline in self-response of the non-citizen population and a decrease in the accuracy of responses. That's Census Bureau research that's available today. So there are a lot of concerns about that question.
Okay, we have one more question in the back.
Hi, Denise Ross with the Beck Center at Georgetown. I was wondering if there's a chance of a complete failure in some geographic areas of the census, and if so, how would we know that the census had failed in a specific community?
And by failure, you mean?
An undercount that is so large that it renders the data not useful for its intended purposes.
All right. Bill, have you ever, or John, do you want to?
Bill,
Well, it's certainly possible, I guess you could say, but I'm not sure that it would depend. Yes. It's certainly possible, but I'm not sure what you would call a complete failure. I mean, at some point, There's going to be what's called non-response follow-up to the people who don't fill out the census form. That's very, very expensive. The issue could still be at that point. That's not always perfect. That often has bigger problems than the people who actually fill out the form in the first place, because it's going to people who didn't fill out the form in the first place. So I suspect there may be a set of neighborhoods, a couple places that may have, very bad census results. If it was widespread enough, that would call the whole question into census, the whole census into question. But let's hope that's not the case.
Yes, John.
I mentioned just one thing. You asked how would they know. So the Census Bureau uses a few different techniques to measure the accuracy of the census, which they will make available. So there will be information regarding the quality of the 2020 census. Some information will come out concurrent with the release of the first census data. Others will take a little longer. But the Census Bureau and local demographers will definitely be producing measures of the accuracy of the 2020 census.
And I also think it's why it'll be important to have local elected officials really engage, because local elected officials know their community, know their towns and cities, and obviously not to a T, but it'll be important for local electeds to voice concerns if they are perceiving there to be an undercount, particularly depending on different blocks and the like. And presumably, if there is some sense that there is some kind of systematic undercount, whether it's local or, God forbid, something much bigger, which none of us want to talk about because we're all working to make sure that everyone is counted. There will be litigation. There will be advocacy on the Hill. There will be advocacy locally. So, there will be a very significant response. It's why the infrastructure that's getting set up right now is going to continue even through 2020 because there will be efforts by the Bureau to make up for whatever. They're going to double check with administrative records and the like to make sure that they have as accurate a count as possible, but then there will be visibility to local electeds and an advocacy response should there be a worst case scenario, which we're all hoping to avoid.
Okay, I thought we had one more question up front. Right here, yeah.
Hey, first of all, thank you all for joining us today. Brian Egan with the National League of Cities as well. One of the things that I think gets lost in a lot of the conversation around the citizenship question is that the previous administration made actual suggestions, proactive suggestions around sexual orientation, around race and ethnicity, around adding a couple other options. Could you all talk for a moment about what that research kind of panned out to indicate what suggestions there should have been and why those suggestions weren't adopted?
Yeah. What a subject.
I advocated for the inclusion, so somebody else.
No.
Inflicted.
So very briefly, there were a couple things. The Census Bureau itself did a lot of research on how to ask the race and ethnicity and determined a better format to ask that than had been used previously, a single question that combined the two. They never got any feedback from OMB, so they were not able to adopt that testing for the 2020 census. They just ran out of time. The other issue was the previous, under the previous Justice Department asked that information on sexual orientation and gender identity be placed on the American Community Survey. There have been a lot of requests for that, including 80 members of Congress wrote a letter to the census, to me actually, asking for that. Again, when the administration changed, that there was never a push to put that on the American Community Survey, so that sort of went away too.
Okay. I think we're good. Thank you so much. This was really very informative. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.